Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Villamoria, and I'm the KeyBank Professor and Chair of Organizational Behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. For this session, we'll be focusing on the representation of women at the top. Our agenda is to discuss what is the representation of women in senior leadership positions across the world, and we'll focus particularly on top management teams and boards of directors. We'll discuss what is the glass ceiling phenomenon, and why does it matter for us to have more women at the top in our organizations, as well as what are some countries across the world doing to address and correct the glass ceiling effect. In the next few slides, you'll see the share of board seats that are held by women across different countries in the world. This slide focuses on the share of board seats that are held by women across Europe. And as you can see, there's a big range across the many different countries here. The highest percentage of board seats held by women in any country is currently by Norway. That was the initiator of legislation to make sure that women were represented on corporate boards that were listed on their country's stock exchange. In Asia-Pacific countries as well, women's share of board seats has a wide range from almost 20% to 3%. In North America, particularly in Canada and the US, this has been a fairly stable number, ranging around 17 to 20% in the US and Canada. The status of women in US business is a very interesting diagram. This diagram has been put out by Catalyst, which is a research-based firm out of New York that studies and advocates for women in leadership positions at the highest levels in U.S. business as well as across the world. Their analysis shows that while there are almost parity at the middle levels of management, 51% of mid-level managers and professionals are women, subsequent levels higher show declining percentages of women in leadership, such that at the highest levels of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, 5% are women. Among all of the different companies at the highest levels, a minuscule proportion is held by women. These numbers have been fairly stable over the last 10 years. There has been some growth, but in the last 10 years we've seen a plateauing of these numbers. So much so that Catalyst CEO at the time said, corporate America has got to get unstuck. And if this represented a patient's pulse, she'd be dead. This is a slide of women in U.S. finance and insurance businesses, again focusing on the proportions of women at all levels in these large corporations. While there's a majority of women at the lower levels, at the highest levels, the numbers decline precipitously. And women in U.S. law firms shows us the same pattern. Again, women associates, 45%. Managing partners, 5%. Here's what Catalyst, who did the study, had to say. Given the rate of change, Catalyst estimates that it will take more than a woman lawyer who was born in 2010 entire lifetime to achieve equality. Let's look at women in U.S. healthcare. Again, a majority of women in the labor force are women in healthcare. The percentage of CEOs, non-existent. Women in academic leadership. This is a particularly important aspect because the majority of all college students today in the U.S. are women. And this is a pattern that is replicated in many other countries across the world, where more college students are women than men. Yet at the higher levels, women are poorly represented in leadership and senior leadership positions. I want to share with you the proportion of women in senior management across 45 countries. This was a recent study that was done by Grant Thornton. And they found that the proportion of women in senior management for many countries, particularly in the emerging world, is much higher than those in the developed world. This is a very interesting pattern of findings because it indicates that there is great opportunity for established economies like the US and the UK and in many areas of Europe for the growth of women in senior management and leadership. Here's what they're saying. This is a quote from the National Managing Partner of Diversity and Inclusion at Grant Thornton that did the study that I just mentioned in the previous slide. It's no longer feasible for U.S. businesses to adopt a sit-and-wait policy when it comes to promoting women to senior management roles, particularly when so many other nations, developed and emerging, are more rapidly realizing the benefits of diverse senior leadership. It's not just the developed world that has opportunity for growth in women in senior leadership. There are other countries as well where there is great opportunity, and great change is happening in these countries as well, and more is welcomed. I give you two examples, India and Australia. Again, they are examples where there is great opportunity for growth of women in business, especially at the senior leadership, so that the countries can better utilize the talents of their full workforce. It's not just in business, it's also in government. Women's representation in national legislatures or parliaments out of 188 direct election countries showed that North America, Canada, and the US trail other countries greatly in the representation of women in national legislatures or parliaments. Take a look at the top 10 countries. Take a look also at the countries with democratically elected women heads of state. There are many opportunities here for other countries to democratically elect women to senior leadership positions in government. Why so few? Why so slow? What are the barriers to women's advancement? And there are many that were laid out. Some that pertain to the organization, some that pertain to interpersonal barriers, and some that are personal challenges. The rest of the course will focus on all of these different barriers. But on the level of the organization, it has to do with the culture of the company. It has to do with who gets selected for senior leadership positions and what are the preferences that are made in these decisions. What can be done to enable the majority male peers to bring up the status and representation of women? On an interpersonal level, what kinds of biases, stereotypes, and preconceptions are operating, sometimes on an implicit and unconscious basis? How can we include more people in informal networks so that the barriers can be lessened, and provide mentors so that it equips women to be more effective in leadership? At the personal level, there are also challenges. There are certain kinds of leadership skills that women sometimes need to develop. The few that we'll focus on in this course are self-confidence, political savvy, and negotiation skills. There are also other home life responsibilities and choices that are made by women, just like they're made by men, that may be explanations for the advancement of women to senior leadership. A particular barrier that I'd like to focus on is the glass ceiling, which the U.S. Federal Glass Ceiling Commission defined as the seen yet unreachable barrier that keeps minorities and women from rising to the upper rungs of the corporate ladder, regardless of their qualifications or achievements. The glass ceiling applies to women as a group. Because they are women, they're kept from advancing higher. This is a very important construct to understand as an explanation for the slow advancement and the few women at the top of organizations across the world. Why is it important to have more women at the top? Frankly, our organizations need women leaders. Studies have shown in a remarkably consistent fashion that companies with more women in top leadership positions financially outperform those with fewer. And this is both on accounting performance indicators as well as on stock market performance indicators. Companies with more women on their boards of directors are likely to have more women corporate officers 5 years later. This study and this set of findings tells us that by having more women on the board, we're more likely to have more diversity in the senior management structures. And companies with more women in senior leadership positions practice more corporate philanthropy and have higher quality corporate social responsibility initiatives, all factors that are very important for our communities. And so, without any doubt, having more women in senior leadership positions is beneficial to corporations. Here's what Christine Lagarde, who was at the time France's finance minister, and she said this in an International Herald Tribune editorial page at the height of the 2008 global financial crisis. If Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, today's economic crisis clearly would look quite different. This is a bit of a funny quote, but it has an important message about the value of having women in senior leadership discussion. Having them around the table improves the quality of the discussion and removes the likelihood of a homogeneous point of view. Let's see what CEO Jim Turley of E&Y had to say. And this was an editorial that he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, also right around the time of the height of the financial crisis. He said, "It's not that women make better decisions, have a greater sense of risk, or can sniff out fraud better than men. But they tend to approach decisions differently than men, with different frames of reference. Not having enough women in positions of power and decision-making capacities has deprived major firms and the global economy of the diversity in thinking and resulting positive outcomes which were desperately needed then and now. True success will occur when organizations understand that the best strategy is one reached after including a broad variety of views and perspectives. From men and women, young and old, those who have wildly different interests, academic backgrounds, or speak different languages." And this, folks, is the value of women. Women also carry great economic clout. They control about $20 billion in annual spending in the U.S., which represents a growth market more than twice as big as China or India combined. They control 73% of U.S. consumer spending, including automobiles, electronics, and household goods. In the U.S., 4 out of 10 working wives earned more than their husbands in 2014. And if the trends continue, the U.S. Department of Labor estimates that the next generation of family will be supported by more women than men. And in 2012, there were 8.3 million women-owned businesses in the U.S., generating an enormous revenue of $1.3 trillion. This economic clout is somehow not well represented at the top of our corporations and our organizations, whether in government, in business, even in nonprofits. What are some of the different strategies that countries are using to overcome the glass ceiling? Some countries are using gender quotas. You can see the examples of these countries. Others are moving towards what is called a minimum objective. The EU is a good example of that. Other countries are using a corporate disclosure requirement or target suggestions. You can see the different examples of the countries that are using these. And yet other countries are using voluntary measures to enable women to rise to the top of their organizations and overcome the glass ceiling. Women in emerging markets provide a very interesting example of no quotas, but great change. The highest proportions of women with senior roles are in what is called the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Women comprise, in total, 30% of senior management positions in the BRIC nations, which is higher than the global average. Russia has the highest proportion of women in senior management globally. The Baltic states have more than 30%. And between 2012 and 2013, China doubled the number of senior management roles held by women from 25% to 51%. Again, this is data from the study by Grant Thornton. So these data indicate that there are a number of different ways by which countries, governments, and companies can advance women to the top of their organizations and change the representation of women at the top. I'd like to conclude the session we've had so far with the following points. Women have made great strides, but there is much opportunity for continued advancement. The glass ceiling is a powerful barrier to women's advancement to senior leadership. Countries are using a variety of methods to address and correct the glass ceiling effect. By acknowledging that the glass ceiling is a collective challenge to overcome, women can support and mentor each other, and organizations can better support women to reach their full potential and make positive contributions to their organizations and society. I'd like to now invite you to complete the homework assignment by researching the answers to the following questions using web sources or potentially by speaking with leaders in your organization. What is the representation of women at the top of your organization, your industry, and your country? In which industries are women well represented in your country, and in which industries are they not well represented? Summarize your answers in 300 words or so. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Diana Bellamoria, KeyBank Professor and Chair of Organizational Behavior at Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. In this session, we will be covering what are the advancement barriers and challenges for women. We'll focus in particular on the organizational, interpersonal, and personal barriers and challenges. We'll reference what has come to be called second-generation bias. We'll discuss what is the meaning of accumulation of disadvantage and develop some strategies to overcome biases, barriers, and challenges. There are many reasons for women's lack of advancement or slow advancement to senior leadership. They include organizational barriers, such as unfriendly corporate policies and culture, lack of examples of successful and inspiring women at the top, and lack of systematic developmental opportunities for women. There are also some interpersonal barriers, such as biases and stereotyping and preconceptions about the roles and abilities of women as leaders. Sometimes women are excluded from the informal leadership networks that are necessary for advancement. And sometimes women lack mentors who can open up the doors for senior leadership positions. As always, there are also personal challenges, some that have to do with key leadership skills, as well as personal life responsibilities and choices that are made by women and men. I would like to discuss second-generation bias by contrasting it with first-generation bias. First-generation bias tends to be deliberate barriers and overt discrimination. Sometimes sexual harassment and sometimes overt forms of sexual discrimination are still prevalent in organizations as first-generation gender bias. However, much more prevalent is second-generation gender bias. This is the unconscious, subtle, invisible, and inadvertent barriers, defined as the powerful yet often invisible barriers to women's advancement that arise from cultural beliefs about gender, as well as workplace structures, practices, and patterns of interaction that inadvertently favor men. So, second-generation gender bias does not happen deliberately. It does not happen overtly. Second-generation bias tends to be gender bias that is embedded into the fabric of the social structures of society and of organizations. It's about the way by which work happens that is commonly understood as the roles of men and women. These are the unconscious and invisible patterns of behavior that are replicated in such a way that they advantage men and disadvantage women. Second-generation bias consists of 4 different aspects, as highlighted by a recent publication in the Harvard Business Review. First, a lack of role models for women, particularly when they don't see role models who look like them at the top of organizations. This can have a very dampening effect on the advancement of women to senior leadership. A second bias consists of gendered career paths and gendered work. There are some paths that are just predominantly occupied by one gender and not by another. A third kind of second-generation gender bias is women's lack of access to networks and sponsors. And a fourth kind of gender bias is what we call the double bind, which is a mismatch between conventionally feminine qualities and the qualities thought necessary for leadership. I'll discuss each of these in just a little bit more detail in the following slides. Here's a slide that represents the unconscious gender bias. It's a slide of a website of an educational institution. It's no longer there. It was put up many years ago, but it's a very interesting slide. Take a look at the descriptions of the students, the faculty, and the alumni for each of the individuals that is pictured there. A very distinct pattern that you will see is that the women are described in terms of hobbies and in terms of personal achievements, whereas the men in these 3 categories of students, faculty, and alums are described in terms of their professional accomplishments and their expertise. It is not clear who submitted these descriptors. It might have been the persons themselves, or it might have been the person creating the website. Regardless, what it shows is that when women are depicted in terms of their professional qualifications, what is emphasized instead is their personal qualifications. Whereas for men, what is emphasized is more their professional competence and their talents and expertise. This is a good example of unconscious gender bias. Let's take a different sector altogether. This is stars in Hollywood. It's very interesting that the average age when a male actor reaches his earnings peak in Hollywood is 51, whereas the average age when a female actor reaches her earnings peak in Hollywood is 34. The more interesting set of findings in this study was that the male earnings stay stable beyond earnings peak, whereas female earnings decline precipitously beyond earnings peak. This again reveals to us the unconscious gender bias that punishes women as they age, whereas men are not similarly punished when they age. Another study that was done by our colleagues looks at the unconscious schemas, the implicit understandings about motherhood that are held by not just 1 or 2 people, but by every one of us. When evaluating identical applications in an experimental study, mothers were less likely to be recommended for hire, promotion, and management, and were offered lower starting salaries than non-mothers. Evaluators rated mothers as less competent and less committed to paid work than non-mothers. However, fathers were seen as more committed to paid work and offered higher starting salaries than non-fathers. This same pattern was replicated in a workplace study that looked at applicants to particular jobs. Prospective employers called mothers back about half as often as non-mothers, but fathers were not disadvantaged in the hiring process. There are some deep and unconscious schemas about women who are mothers as they move towards leadership in organizations. An explanation that has been offered is called the accumulation of advantage and the accumulation of disadvantage, described in the book Why So Slow by my colleague Virginia Valian. Very small differences in treatment can have major consequences as they accumulate. Like interest on capital, advantages accrue. Like interest on debt, disadvantages accrue. Mountains are molehills, piled one on top of the other, indicating that many trivial incidents accumulate to significant consequences for women as they move on the path to senior leadership. Here's an example of the accumulation of advantage that was offered by the CEO of E&Y. This quote was taken from a recent article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review, where he said, "I like to facilitate our board discussions by getting right into the most contentious points. And we were having a discussion around a particular topic. 3 women on the board made individual comments that were similar in direction, which I didn't respond to. Not long after they spoke, a 4th person, who happened to be a man, made a comment in line with what the women had been saying. And I picked up on his comment. I said, I think that Jeff's got it right. Not even aware of what I had just done. To their great credit, the women didn't embarrass me publicly. They pulled me to the side and they said, Jim, we know you didn't mean for this to be the way it was received. But this is what happened. They played it back to me, and they said, that's what happens to women throughout their careers. It was a learning moment for me. So what this quote illustrates is that the accumulation of disadvantage can be consequential for the advancement of women, not in a single incident or an individual event, which seems to be so trivial, but when there is a continuous and consistent pattern of one's ideas being attributed to others, we lose the advantage that we could have received that would have been helpful to us in gaining us the visibility and attention of other senior leaders in our organizations. Another example of the second-generation bias is the double standards that are often used for women and men in organizations. This is a quote from Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook and author of Lean In, where she highlights that when girls act in certain ways, they're called bossy. But when boys act in those same ways, they're called leaders. So we might consider that girls who are bossy should actually be told that they have great leadership skills. There are many different myths and stereotypes that women face in the workplace. Stereotypes are generalizations about individuals based on perceptions of a group to which that person belongs. And myths are stories or dramas that represent others and self-expectations. Stereotypes and myths prevent gathering information about the individual. They influence how we interpret and evaluate a person. Sometimes these stereotypes become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they're very complex and paradoxical. Sometimes they can be motivating, and sometimes they can be limiting. They can be both productive and self-defeating. I invite you to think about a stereotype that is held about your own group. When is it motivating, and when is it limiting to your advancement? Here are some myths and stereotypes that are often faced by women leaders that I have gathered in my coaching of many women executives. There are stereotypes that they're not qualified, that they're difficult or intimidating, emotional. There's a strong myth of a workhorse. A workhorse is somebody who is capable of doing sort of mid-level work, the execution of the vision, rather than the strategic leadership that might be needed. Other myths and stereotypes are that women are not connected, that they're not seen, that they're invisible, or that they may cut back and bail out, particularly when there are some difficulties. There may be many other stereotypes and myths about women leaders in your company, in your industry, and in your country. And I invite you to identify what those are so that you can get a picture of some of the advancement barriers and challenges that women face in their rise to senior leadership. I want to speak to the double bind for women. A particular element of the double bind is what is called competence versus likability. Here's how it's explained. When women exhibit traditionally valued leadership behaviors, such as assertiveness, they tend to be seen as competent, but not personable or well-liked. Yet those women who do adopt a more stereotypically feminine style are liked, but not seen as having valued leadership skills. So this is the double bind that often makes it very difficult for women to walk the fine line balancing between competence and likability. Why is gender bias unconscious? And why is it so prevalent? Because most people view themselves as fair and impartial. They believe that advancement is merit-based. Sometimes people admire the competence of some women, which seems to show that they're free of gender bias. Some women, though the exception, make it to the top, appearing to demonstrate that evaluations are basically fair and that truly capable women can succeed. However, it's hard to remember that an exception is just that. It's an atypical event, and therefore actually the evidence is that the norm is different and that the exception stands out. Let's take a little bit of time to focus on how to overcome these barriers, whether they're perceptual barriers or cultural societal barriers. I recently had the opportunity to talk with Gloria Steinem, author and activist, founding editor of Ms. Magazine. And she said in that talk, if you are with those who have more power than you, learn to speak. If you are with those who have less power than you, learn to listen. And this is a powerfully wise advice for all of us, to learn to speak up or to learn to listen. At the organizational level, strategies to overcome bias and barriers include engaging the collective power of others to change policies and practices, working with advocates in HR or senior leadership. At the interpersonal level, using a friendly approach to challenge myths and stereotypes that are held about women. Speaking up for other women in the organization, and finding allies and connecting with them about your shared experience. On the personal level, developing key leadership skills of self-confidence, political savvy, and negotiation. And becoming more aware of and working to undo any internalized stereotypes that we hold. In conclusion, over the course of this session, the main learning points are that women face unique challenges and barriers as they rise to leadership in their workplaces. Because of these challenges, it is even more important for women to invest in their own leadership development. By connecting with and engaging others, women and men can change their organizations for the better. Let me invite you to undertake the homework assignment of connecting with the experience of others. We invite you to interview a senior woman in your organization, your industry, or your country, to hear her story of the challenges she faced and how she overcame those to become successful. We invite you to summarize your learnings from this interview in a 600-word executive briefing report. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our course, Women in Leadership, Inspiring Positive Change. Today we focus on women's leadership presence, particularly referencing self-confidence. In this course so far, we have discussed women's strengths and opportunities, your leadership values and vision, as well as issues of the glass ceiling and advancement barriers for women. You've had the opportunity for self-reflection and also for connecting with others around women's experiences as leaders. Our agenda for today is to address what has come to be known as the gender confidence gap, where women are attributed to have lower self-confidence than men, particularly for positions of leadership. We will reframe self-confidence as consisting of 4 pillars: authenticity, self-efficacy, adaptability and resourcefulness, and persistence and grit. And we'll focus also on how demonstrating self-confidence through voice and effective nonverbal communication benefits women and men in organizations. Drawing on what you've learned by relating to other women, we are going to take a more relational approach to today's topic of self-confidence. I have asked one of my own mentees, Keimei Sugiyama, to join us today. She will cover what the research suggests about self-confidence as it is perceived today, and then I will discuss a more inclusive reframing of self-confidence. And finally, Keimei will share her own self-confidence story to start a conversation around how we collectively experience self-confidence. Although there's research that suggests that there is a gender confidence gap, I do not want you to come away from this video thinking that women are less self-confident than men. What we are calling for is an understanding that women have different sources of self-confidence and a reframing that can help women to value and to draw out their innate self-confidence. I'll now ask Keimei to start by reviewing some of the existing studies on gender and self-confidence. Please welcome Keimei Sugiyama.
Thank you, Diana, for the opportunity to connect with this amazing group of women and men participating in this course. As Diana mentioned, I'm Keimei Sugiyama, and I'm currently a PhD student in the Organizational Behavior Department at Case Western Reserve University. I previously worked in human resources and human capital consulting for over 10 years, and I'm studying gender, diversity, and inclusion under Diana's guidance. One of our more recent projects is to develop a more inclusive reframing of self-confidence. As part of this project, we reviewed the research that is contributing to the perception that there is a gender confidence gap. These studies suggest that women are more modest in their estimates of their own intelligence, while men overestimate. Women also tend to internally attribute performance challenges, and when they do perform, ascribe their achievements to others, luck, or timing. They may even underestimate their level of performance altogether, depending on the type of task that's involved. One interpretation of these studies is that women have lower self-confidence. Yet what we'd like to do now is take each one of these findings and turn them into opportunities. To start, let's reframe the first two studies. Humility is perhaps what allows women to act with more integrity and authenticity. Overestimating creates inaccuracy and misrepresentation that could inhibit performance. Internal attribution may provide the incentive to persist in overcoming challenges, whereas external attribution does not take ownership for continued growth that may be needed. The next two studies indicate that there is opportunity to improve the relational context for women's self-confidence. Imposter syndrome tended to be found in women who had internalized family or general societal expectations that were invalidating of their intelligence. In the next study, that the sex typing of task affected performance estimation also suggests that socialization influenced the self-perception of ability. What is needed is a redefining of self-confidence that allows women to undo the harmful effects of societal expectations and invalidation. McKinsey's study of women leaders found self-confidence to be the level of self-assuredness arising from an appreciation of one's own abilities or qualities. This appreciation may come from the accumulation of experience and success, but also through relational contexts. For example, women's confidence in knowing who they are and their own self-image increased when they were first primed by writing descriptions of their close friendships. Mentors have also been found to increase confidence, and when provided expert advice, women were more likely to overcome any underestimation of performance and increase the overall collective performance in simulations of competitive tournaments. Negative internalizations and the way that self-confidence is perceived by others has led to biased conclusions that women are less confident than men. What we propose is that women can overcome these misperceptions by engaging with the 4 pillars of self-confidence, drawing on women's strengths: authenticity, self-efficacy, adaptability, and persistence. And supporting the foundation of these pillars are the effective use of voice and nonverbal communication. Diana will now discuss each of these aspects of internalizing and demonstrating positive self-confidence.
As we have discussed, there are 4 pillars to self-confidence. Let me go through each one of these by highlighting some key learnings for all of us. The first one is authenticity, which is defined as actions that are consistent with deeply held values and beliefs. There are many times when authenticity is challenged, called to question. Sometimes that happens when we reconnect with goals and dreams that have not yet been achieved. Sometimes that happens when the context changes and puts our values and behaviors at odds. Sometimes authenticity is challenged by major life events. Sometimes authenticity is challenged when women try to fit into male-dominated environments. And sometimes it is a major life events that occur in women's lives that might call into question the consistency between values and actions. A second pillar of self-confidence is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that I can achieve my goals and succeed in a role. It's a belief in one's more agentive leadership capabilities, which refers to taking more initiative, more action, and more risk, and leading and directing your future. Self-efficacy results from qualifications, experiences, credibility, and reputation. Leaders with high self-efficacy are typically more effective. The challenge, of course, for women is that in male-dominated environments, women can sometimes have lower self-efficacy expectations than men. A third pillar of self-confidence is adaptability. So adaptability enhances confidence by providing the belief that one can be resourceful to find solutions to any challenge or barrier and use the strengths of interpersonal skills and connection to build networks of resources. Now, women have an advantage many times with regard to adaptability because they've had to adapt to multiple work and family roles throughout their lives, providing opportunities for developing this particular skill of leadership. Adaptability includes the ability to take on new leadership behaviors that are required at the next level of advancement. So again, adaptability is a key pillar that helps us to develop and demonstrate self-confidence. And the final pillar that we'd like to refer to is what we call persistence or grit, which is the ability to persevere for the long term, rather than allowing short-term challenges to supersede accomplishments for the future. Resilience is an important part of persistence, and responding with resilience enables people to overcome failure and disappointment. Another element of persistence is grit, which we can define as resolve and character, or the passion and the perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is about having stamina and endurance. It is about sticking with the future day after day, not just today and not just for now, but over the long run, year after year, month after month, and week after week. With grit, people can persist and overcome any challenges and barriers that may hold them back from achieving their vision and fulfilling their values. Another element of self-confidence is demonstrating voice as well as effective nonverbal communication. Voice is about having the courage to say what needs to be said to improve the outcome, but in a way that can be heard. I encourage everyone here to focus on what are the things that must be said so that they're able to raise their voice for the key leadership issues that need to be addressed and dealt with. A second element is nonverbal communication, which research shows is the bulk of the impact that a person can have in communication. It consists of our facial expressions, our body movements and posture, gestures, eye contact, and tone of voice. And these speak the loudest, enabling us to be trusted by sending signals that match our words. Effective leaders respond non-verbally in ways that show that they understand, notice, and care. These four pillars consisting of authenticity, self-efficacy, adaptability, and persistence, undergirded by effective voice and nonverbal communication, women and men can start to respond much more self-confidently in the face of challenges and barriers and leadership positions that require courage and risk. Next, as a way to illustrate this reframing of self-confidence, I'd like to ask Keme to share her own self-confidence story. And as Keme shares her story, I invite you to think about your own self-confidence stories as well.
Thank you, Diana. As I thought about my story, I realized that it really illustrates all 4 pillars of self-confidence. And it's about the time that I applied to and interviewed for the PhD program in organizational behavior here at Case Western Reserve University. Before I applied to Case, I had been working on a book with my mentor from my master's program. During this time, I met my now husband, Jesse. They say that life is what happens when you're making other plans, and that was certainly the case for me. With the attitude that life is an adaptation, I knew that I had to figure out a way to work out a new vision of my future that included the partner that I chose to live my life with. Between a wedding, a book, and a demanding consulting schedule, I had my hands full, but never gave up on my dream to go to Case and become a scholar. With the support of my husband and with the strong belief in my ability to pursue research, 2 years later than I had originally intended, I persisted in applying to Case and luckily got an interview. The best way that I can describe my experience interviewing with the Case Organizational Behavior Department was that I had found my intellectual home. I was energized and inspired and truly felt that I was living my best self. It may be strange to think that I felt the most authentic during an interview, but that was a sign to me that I had found the right program, and it's been confirmed ever since, particularly through the mentoring that I've received through Diana. My self-confidence story includes the 4 pillars, but also the positive social validation and support that exists in a more inclusive and relational reframing of self-confidence. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my self-confidence story.
Thank you, Keme, for sharing your most moving story about self-confidence and your journey to extraordinary leadership. I would now like to invite all of you to join us in this next exercise about your self-confidence journey. Think of a time when you felt self-confident. What led to this feeling? What were the outcomes? Now think of a time when you did not feel self-confident. What led to this feeling and what were the outcomes? As you begin to reflect on these 2 different sets of experiences, make note of the insights about yourself that emerge from these reflections. So, in conclusion, women are sometimes attributed to have lower self-confidence, especially for challenging leadership situations. By redefining self-confidence as a combination of authenticity, self-efficacy, adaptability, and persistence, and by demonstrating effective voice and nonverbal communications, women can feel and demonstrate greater self-confidence, especially in challenging leadership situations. Our homework assignment is a self-confidence assessment, which we invite you to complete at the website mentioned in the syllabus. Once you've taken that assessment, write a 300-word reflection about the insights you gained about your own self-confidence from the exercises of today, as well as the self-assessment. Thank you very much.